Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. I'm Harriet Frew, Eating Disorder Therapist, here to support you in overcoming disordered eating and finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Now today I want to talk about the eating disorder voice. And before I launch in, I really just want to say that not everyone with an eating disorder will experience an eating disorder voice. Everyone's experience is slightly unique. I know from my own personal experience, I had a very, very strong inner critic that I would have called it, but I didn't really identify with having an ED voice. So I think, again, everyone's experience will be slightly different. Take from this what is helpful, reject what isn't. And I think ultimately, whatever you call that inner critic, whether it's the ED voice or the inner critic, or you have a name for it or something else, the things I'm going to talk about will hopefully be very relatable, but your own individual experience may be slightly different. Okay, so let's talk about the eating disorder voice. The ED voice is a punishing, bullying, destructive voice that can dominate your day and direct your thoughts and actions. It often dictates food rules, exercise regimes, work tasks, and more. So it's not just about food, it's often about everything you do in your life. And it's always pushing the limits for harder, stricter, further, push. And it tends to be extremely mistrusting of others, and also will encourage you to isolate and withdraw. And its perspective isn't kind. Its perspective is very much the world is to be feared and do not trust anyone. If you walk X number of steps, then you can have the biscuit. You've got to earn everything. Everything's got to be like hard work. People might finally like you if you lose weight. The eating disorder voices can label you with horrible, horrible names. It might as well say, don't take a break, keep on going. It can be very, very unkind. And as much as you loathe the voice, you might also find some comfort and safety in its presence. And not everyone experiences the voice in the same way, if at all. For some, it feels like an external voice with tone, pitch, and volume conveyed in a strikingly different way from your own expression. So it might almost feel like another voice in your head, which isn't actually your voice. But for others, and this is how I experienced it, it's your own inner critic. Now, whichever way you experience it, there's no right or wrong. As a therapist, I would interpret the voice as an unconscious internalization of your real life experiences. So what I find is inside the therapy room, my clients with the most severe, abusive, bullying voice tend to have experienced repetitive, traumatic situations where they have been judged or criticized. And I guess it's really important to stress here that this drip impact of pervasive commentary is so severely impactful, and sometimes more so than a one-off big T trauma event in isolation. Now, that's not to negate anyone's big T trauma event. I think whatever you have been through, if it has impacted you and impacted your well-being and you're holding trauma in the body, it is really valid. But I guess I just really want to emphasize that the drip impact sometimes of repetitive comments from people close to us can be so damaging. And we often overlook this because, we might also really love these people. We might be actually very close to them. And it's a bit more kind of complicated than just this is some terrible person in my life. You might have someone in your life who was really, really critical about some aspect of your appearance or something about you, but also you had a relationship where you loved that person as well. So it's very confusing. So the eating disorder voice is probably rooted in many experiences. It might be a parent, a teacher, friend in air quotes there. I mean, a real friend is not going to judge you or criticize you, but anyone who has perhaps consistently judged your body, and it may have involved relentless bullying at school or work. I think bullying is so impactful. Now, what tends to happen is repetitive feedback in a negative way like that, it creates deeply internalized wounds in your psyche. So those voices become deeply internalized in your psyche. Now, it's not a conscious thing often, but as numerous thoughts, they tend to then circle on repeat. They're just circling in your mind again and again and again to later create rock solid beliefs about your unworthiness, your unlovability, and perceived failure at life. So basically a belief is just a thought that we have thought again and again and again and again that's got very deep roots. And it can feel like the voice becomes you, your essence, your whole being. And from my experience in the therapy room, if you're highly sensitive, the voice tends to be amplified. I mean, of course, because of if you're sensitive, your empathy and feeling is very kind of high, isn't it? And you've understandably then, you're going to absorb positive and negative things very deeply, but you're going to absorb those negative comments like a thirsty sponge when you're young and vulnerable. And also, if you're neurodivergent, the voice may be repetitive, loud, and whirring on repeat. And it seems, and this again is anecdotal evidence from the therapy room, and I'm not saying this is true for everybody who is neurodivergent, but what I'm experiencing in the therapy room is that neurodivergent individuals can experience an exaggerated form of repetitive thought cycling simply by how their brain functions, okay? So again, there's no judgment there. It's just something I've noticed, that if you are neurodivergent, you may really have a very amplified critical voice. And what's interesting as well is research in anorexia nervosa patients indicates that the voice is more severe in people with enduring eating disorders and with severe symptoms. And I guess, again, this kind of makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? Because of, if the longer the voice persists in your mind, really, the more potential for negative influence increases. So let's talk about how to shift gears and let the voice reduce its impact. Okay, so number one is just get curious about the voice. Sadly, you can't just turn the voice off. Wouldn't it be nice if you could flick a switch? Now, getting curious about the voice is not easy work, as the voice may feel like an integral part of you. Begin to recognize, though, that you are not the voice, and the voice is a safety reaction to difficult circumstances, and it's almost like a protective part of you which stepped in to help but has become destructive. So it's often rooted in, a part of you that felt so unsafe in the world that in a way you felt like, if this voice was there, it was almost going to protect you. It could almost say the worst thing before anyone outside could say anything worse. So in some ways you felt some sense of safety. But you can see how toxic that sounds. And although you may not recognize it yet, you have a flourishing, healthy voice within you. You're simply out of touch with it now, okay? Because you were not born into this world with the ED voice, okay? So the first step in shifting relationship towards the voice is to notice its dominance and to show curiosity and questioning towards it. So rather than simply obeying and following orders, just consider first that you could respond in a different way. There may be another way to look at this situation, okay? So probably at the moment you're on autopilot, listening to the voice, doing what it's telling you. It's like a sergeant major possibly in your head, and you're just following instructions. Now, you can even just begin to consider, like, maybe I have a choice here. Maybe this voice doesn't always have my best interests in mind. Maybe I can begin to be curious about it and to even thinking about things in a different way. That's step one, get curious. Okay, number two, get out of fight and flight mode. Okay, again, sounds very easy, doesn't it? You're running on the treadmill of life so fast. It can feel very challenging to slow down. But I think something I've observed, most people with eating disorders run through life so fast, they don't have time to catch a breath. Now, the voice thrives in this excessive fear and anxiety with endless, relentless goals and perfectionism. So you're probably spinning on the hamster wheel of life. You book yourself back-to-back appointments, you have little time for rest or reflection, and you're consequently flooded with adrenaline and cortisol all day. So you're living in terror and ready to flee the bear at any moment. Now, a human with a nervous system in high alert cannot access wise and rational thoughts easily. You are primed to escape from danger and survive. You are in fear. So to tune into your wisdom and supportive inner calm, you need to begin to slow down. And you might think, I don't have time for this. But it doesn't have to involve huge chunks of time or abandoning your responsibilities. It's about injecting little pause moments that can add up to a big deal even, and ripple through your day with surprising effects. So it can be things like, a 5-minute break between meetings to make a conscious cup of tea or walk around, so you're very present, okay? A 15-minute walk in nature at lunchtime. I know for myself, if I'm not in the best mood, going for a walk is always the thing that helps me so much. And I'm not talking about an over-exercise, militant march. I'm talking about a mental health peaceful walk in nature. Okay, next one. 10 minutes of mindful, mundane activity such as washing dishes. Again, just being present, slowing down, noticing your breath, just focusing on the activity in front of you. Maybe talking to a colleague or a friend for 5 minutes who uplifts your energy. Okay, so interrupting the flow of your work or whatever you're doing. Even just going to the bathroom, taking a few deep breaths, just like pausing, taking a breath, standing back. Now, the little moments can be impactful because you're releasing built up pressure and tension in micro doses. You're beginning to tune into your needs and honor them more. And this prevents the building up of volcanic-like eruption pressure, which results from ignoring your needs for hours on end. And I know particularly people that binge eat often will be suppressing their needs all day, like going, looking after everyone else, never taking any breaks, just not listening to their hunger, just ploughing on, forcing on through. They finally come up for air later on in the day. There's so much built up tension, so much built up stress, and then the binge is almost like a relief. It's a way to escape off the treadmill of life. But if you're releasing your energy in micro doses throughout the day, coming back to the present moment, being more calm, being more regulated, it will help to dial down the voice. Okay, number 3, release the trauma and underlying feelings and start to develop self-compassion. So I guess the eating disorder voice has trauma roots, okay? So you can't just positive your way out of the eating disorder voice, okay? And so what is really important, yes, we don't want to be focusing on the past for months, years, weeks, whatever, but it is important to take time to explore the deeper issues and to bring the unresolved issues into awareness, because often what you might be doing is pushing all of that down, pushing it down. But what happens is the eating disorder voice is a bit like the elephant in the room, really, where it's just shouting at you because none of that deeper trauma has been processed. It's all there within the body, and you are experiencing it as this self-critical, denigrating voice. So when you feel ready to look at the trauma, the underlying feelings, it involves naming those past things and giving yourself a voice. Thinking about, how did it feel for me to go through those things? What was it like? Just to really sort of touch base with maybe some of the things that happened. And this can be done in therapy, can be done by talking to a trusted friend, through somatic work, journaling, or self-reflection. And it involves the recognition of how these challenging events are now affecting your present day emotions, your behaviours, your relationships, and the way you talk to yourself. Now, I know in my own healing journey, I was repeatedly told by my dad that I was incompetent and a letdown to him. And I understand now that this was something he heard many times from his own father, and he was just unconsciously passing the baton of this generational trauma to me. Now, those words, though, that incompetence and feeling like a letdown, those words profoundly influence my self-perception. My inner critic would say those words to me over and over again in my teens and 20s. Every situation or relationship I entered was shaped through that distorted lens, and it was so destructive. And just imagine if I had never healed this, if I'd never really looked at the roots of those issues, I never really released those feelings, really understood the impact of what happened, I wouldn't be here talking to you today. I would probably still very much feel in the kind of victim mode. I would feel very, very negative. I would be repeating all of those unconscious patterns again and again and again. Okay. And I think people are often worried about doing the deeper work, what's going to happen? Is it going to affect your relationships? All of these things. Now, I would say, for me, I can have a lot more compassion and understanding towards my dad and to other people in my life since I've done the healing work. Okay. When I was trying to push it all down, I actually felt very, very angry. Even though on the surface I may have been people-pleasing, but I held an awful lot of anger and resentment inside. So once you recognise your unmet needs, you can begin to offer yourself the emotional support, care and understanding that you may have not received from your parents or caregivers or whoever it was. and even if they were genuinely doing the best they could at the time. Okay, so how can you begin to do this? So you can offer yourself validation, compassion, and kindness. Okay, I know for myself, I had to really start to view myself through a different lens. I had to realize, my dad's perception of me is not accurate. Okay, he is carrying a lot of his own trauma and own wounding. I do not have to take that on board. I can start to see myself through a much more healthy lens. Okay, just because of his perception of me is that I'm incompetent and a letdown, that does not mean that that's true. Okay, so also just allowing yourself time to rest and to slow down. Again, if you're zooming through life so fast, it's very hard to access any wise, rational, kind thinking. You'll just be responding from fear. Another thing that can really help is nurturing yourself by doing the things that you love for sheer enjoyment. So it might be like reading, dancing, listening to music, maybe doing some art or something else. Now, I know for myself, one of the things I really love doing is movement, but fun movement. I love doing things like handstands or like beginners parkour, things like that. That really lights me up. I also really enjoy connecting with people who are able to talk on a deep level, who like going beneath the superficial, who like deep conversations. That again for me is really nurturing and very, very enjoyable. You can start to challenge your negative thoughts, or you can also practice mindfulness. I'm thinking through one of my neurodivergent clients I've worked with recently, who has found mindfulness an incredibly helpful practice for countering the eating disorder voice. Things like self-soothing techniques such as breathing, grounding, meditation. Again, you need to kind of just practice different things and see what works for you. It could be with engaging with EFT, emotional freedom technique, where you sort of do tapping on different points on your body. It could be yoga or alternative therapies. It could be visualization and journaling. It could be having therapy, coaching, or some other form of personal development work. And I know the last one here for me is so important. Developing and nurturing authentic relationships where you feel accepted and can be vulnerable. Relationships are the container for healing. Okay, the more people that you have in your life who really know you and where you can show up and be yourself, your whole self, warts and all, that is incredibly healing. And you only need a couple of people in your life who can do that, and it will transform your life, I promise you. By getting in touch with buried emotions and needs, you can begin to process and release trauma and to heal those deep wounds. And through this, you will foster a sense of safety, self-esteem, and inner resilience within yourself. And the old programming will no longer run the show. Now, when I think about the difference in my life compared to when I was in my 20s and how I felt so incompetent, how I felt such a letdown, how I felt like I wasn't doing the right thing by anyone, how I often was just living in anxiety and fear and worried if people liked me and all of these things. Today, I live in a very grounded, peaceful way, and my life isn't perfect. But most of my life these days, I have sort of sculpted in a way where I can create and do things I enjoy. And I have people in my life who I have really deep, compassionate relationships with. I do hobbies that really light me up and bring me joy. I slow down. I take care of myself. All of these things have made such a difference. Okay, number 4, thought challenging. So if you listen to this podcast, you've heard me talk about this quite a lot before, I'm sure. So the eating disorder voice can dominate your thoughts. We have 60,000 plus thoughts per day, and many are repetitive. And as Leo Tzu aptly said, what's your thoughts, they become your words. What's your words, they become your actions. What's your actions, they become your habits. What's your habits, they become your character. And what's your character, it becomes your destiny. So quite a powerful quote, isn't it, really? Because it just makes you realize as well the power of the eating disorder voice is running the show, the power to influence you, really. And actually, do you want that any longer? No, you do not. And then we have the good old diagram from cognitive behavior therapy. So if you are listening, I'll just describe it to you, but also if you're on Substack, you can actually look at the image on the page. But where we look at how our thoughts, feelings, behavior, and physical body all interact. So let's just give you an example of this. So say, for example, you have a situation maybe where you eat an unplanned biscuit at work. So maybe the ED voice, your inner critic, will say, you've blown it, you failed at your eating plan. Then it will impact your feelings, your mood. You'll feel guilty, anxious, overwhelmed, ashamed. Behaviour, then you might restrict, or you might eat 10 more biscuits and then go to the vending machine to buy crisps and chocolate. Physically, then you might feel bloated, overfull, sick, dissociated, your skin crawling in disgust. You might have further thoughts from the ED voice. You'll never be free of this. What's the point? The diet starts tomorrow. You failed. All good examples. So what this example illustrates how the unplanned biscuit was realistically quite a minor event. However, the ED voice perception, or the inner critic perception about the biscuit eating, was dramatic and potentially caused more harm. So the inner critic went on a destructive rampage, fear amplified, and every worst case scenario was anticipated. And then the situation felt overwhelming, unmanageable, and there was a kind of hopeless, like what's the point? And just felt as though, a slide into what felt like was an inevitable way of coping. Much of this is unconscious and automatic. But imagine a different way of thinking. Imagine if you ate the unplanned biscuit at work and you thought in a much more wise, kind, rational, slowing down way, I enjoyed that biscuit. It was tasty. I'm pleased to be allowing myself a range of foods without guilt, as I know this is inoculation against binge eating. Your mood then is much more likely to be peaceful, content, satisfied. Your behaviour is much more calm. You might return to work. You might realise you're still hungry and maybe you need to go and get an extra snack, or you might just sit there comfortably and get on with your work. Physical reaction, you're less likely to feel, distracted and having that sort of skin crawling reaction. You'll feel calmer in your body. And then you might have further thoughts to counter the ED voice. You could say things like, I'm proud of myself for tuning into my body and responding to meet my needs. I'm working on self-care and nourishment rather than restriction or overeating. So the rational thought challenging can seem straightforward when you're removed from the eye of the biscuit storm. Thought challenging sounds simple, but it is hard because your old thought patterns have strongly wired neural pathways which automatically fire at rapid speed. So it takes deep awareness and conscious interruption to shift your thinking. So you're basically reprogramming your mind, and you will need to find ways to pause, reflect more, placing a window of opportunity for self-connection into your day. And there'll be inevitable barriers to practicing this. It feels really hard and clunky at the beginning because of your old thoughts will just be firing without any effort at all. Okay, so you've almost got to consciously interrupt them. So how can you begin to shift your thinking? So initially it's like self-awareness. You've got to be aware of the thoughts you're having. So you could write out the little diagram, noticing your thoughts, your feelings, your behaviours and your physical body. So you're bringing awareness to the present moment. Now to begin with, you may not be able to challenge your thoughts. That might just feel impossible, but bringing awareness to the present moment is so important. Also, you might want to speak them out if that's more helpful. You could speak them out to a friend. You could write them down in a journal. Could write them down anywhere really. It's just developing a practice that brings you more into the present and makes you more aware. So how to really challenge the ED voice. So simply changing a negative thought for a positive one often doesn't work because you'll often believe that the negative one is true. Instead, you can challenge the thought with reasonable evidence. This helps access the rational side of your brain. And I often say to my clients, you've just almost got to get your first foot on the bottom rung of the ladder. Okay, you can't be super positive and say a thought that just feels completely unbelievable to you. You've got to start with where you're at. Okay, so it might just be a very small shift in your thinking to begin with. And just to reiterate as well, some degree of calmness first is needed to make this possible. If you are fleeing the bear in your energy, you're not going to be able to think in a calm, rational, kind way. Okay, so sometimes you've almost got to maybe you've got to go for that little 10-minute walk first, or do some breathing, or do something that helps you feel more grounded again. So thought challenging can bring awareness to your current thinking styles. You can stand back and consider how you can look at the situation in a different way. And it's worth remembering that thoughts are only thoughts. They are not facts. And the ED voice will feel like an authority, but louder does not necessarily mean correct. I think that's a really, really important thing. Louder does not necessarily mean correct. And thoughts may feel true, but this does not mean that they are true. They are often an opinion which has been reinforced as truth by your confirmation bias, which we all have, in how you filter and interpret situations. Okay, so when I was thinking that I was incompetent and there was something wrong with me, I would go into every situation looking for that truth. So I would notice if someone gave me a disapproving glance. I would notice if someone's energy was a bit off, and I would think, oh my goodness, that's because of me, because I've done something wrong. I was filtering everything through that lens, okay? And that was not a realistic way to be looking at the world. So if you believe something to be true, you'll unconsciously find the evidence to support this and make it true. So how can you challenge your thinking? Think about, does the thought fit the facts? Is it true? Is it really, really true? And it will likely feel true, but it doesn't make it true, okay? Next one, what does a thought mean to you? For example, if you feel that you must be perfect, this might mean that you don't feel good enough deep down. Next question, does it happen every time? Is this always true? Because we always say things to ourselves like, oh, I always do this. You know, if I look at a biscuit, I always eat 10. Is it true? I'm sure there's many occasions where you have been able to have a different relationship with biscuits. What would you say to a friend who was thinking this? That's always a really good question. How might you have looked at this situation before you became ill, had your current problems? Okay, now if you can remember, before you were ill, you probably looked at things in a very different way. And how do you like to feel about this? I always like this question because I think it brings hope and optimism and demonstrates that there is a different way to think. So I would say as well, if you don't have time to really challenge your thinking with all of those questions, always go for the one, what would I say to a friend who is thinking this? Okay, we're always so much better at being kinder to our friends, much more rational to our friends. Okay, and this can immediately help shift perspective as you're much more likely, as I said, kinder to your friends and yourself. The process of thought challenging takes repetition to gain results. Okay, you're not going to do it once and be in the land of unicorns and rainbows and all the things, because you've been thinking in the old way for a long time, so you've got to really engage with the long game. But have faith and persist. The micro-cumulative shifts will bring transformation over the long term, okay? Your new thinking will ripple into your daily life and create new ways of being, and this will have a knock-on impact of shifting your beliefs, habits, and ultimately your recovery destiny. Now, when I think back to my 20s and how I was constantly thinking every single day, I'm so incompetent, I'm not good enough, I'm a letdown, I do not have those thoughts anymore. Okay, I am an imperfect human being who doesn't always do things right. I make mistakes and, you know, I have my strengths and my weaknesses, but I do not go through life thinking that I'm incompetent and a letdown to other people now. Okay. Number 5, get support if needed. If the eating disorder voice has been shouting in your mind for many months or years, it's going to take time to dilute it. Do not despair. Every ripple in the pond of your thoughts makes a difference as you push back by challenging the voice or simply noticing, questioning, and not responding in the same way anymore. So do get support if you need it, okay? Sometimes this work can feel really hard, and actually reaching out, getting support, that can be the most valuable thing you can do. Okay, hope you've enjoyed this podcast. If you're not following me already on Instagram, do seek me out, the eating disorder therapist _ For further support with your relationship with food, do go to the eatingdisordertherapist.co.uk. If you enjoyed this podcast, I would be so grateful if you'd follow, rate and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.